I used to believe my life was a masterpiece, one I had carefully designed like the buildings I poured my soul into as an architect. My wife, Emma, was the cornerstone of that design. Smart, stunning, and ambitious, she was the perfect partner, the kind of woman men envied me for. Together, we were the golden couple. No cracks, no flaws. Or so I thought. That Thursday evening began like any other. I arrived home late, my hands full of blueprints and sketches for a project I was pitching the next day. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of Emma's voice drifting from her study. I paused for a moment outside the door, smiling to myself as I listened to her laugh, assuming she was on a call with a client or maybe one of her friends. But then I heard his voice. Kyle. The sharp pang of recognition startled me. Kyle, my best friend, my business partner, was on the other end of that call. First, I thought nothing of it. They were close, we all were. It wasn't unusual for them to chat, especially since Kyle and I had been collaborating on a project Emma had provided legal counsel for. Still, something about the way she spoke to him felt off. Her tone was softer, more intimate. I leaned closer, my hand resting on the doorframe, and strained to hear. "You know you drive me crazy?" Emma whispered, her voice carrying a heat I had never heard when she spoke to me. My chest tightened, the air sucked out of the room. A cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck as her words sank in. No, I thought. I must have misunderstood. There's no way. Let's meet at the usual place tomorrow, she continued. I can't wait to see you again. Her words pierced me like a blade. My hands trembled as I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. The usual place? My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I stumbled to the kitchen, unable to breathe. The foundation of my perfect life was crumbling right beneath my feet, and I was paralyzed by the enormity of what I just overheard. For the first time in my life, I didn't know what to do. I barely slept that night. Emma curled up beside me in bed, as she always did, her breathing steady, her hand lightly resting on my chest. But the warmth I once felt from her touch now chilled me to the bone. Her presence was suffocating, her proximity unbearable. I replayed her words to Kyle over and over in my head. You drive me crazy. The usual place. I can't wait to see you again. Was I overreacting? Misinterpreting? Maybe there was an explanation, a logical one that didn't involve betrayal. I had to be sure before I confronted her, or him. The next morning, Emma kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, her smile as radiant as ever. Good luck with your pitch, she said, grabbing her briefcase. I'll see you tonight. I nodded, watching her go, bile rising in my throat. As soon as the door closed behind her, I sprang into action. Her laptop was still open on the kitchen counter. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the keyboard. It felt wrong to invade her privacy, but hadn't she already invaded our trust? With trembling fingers, I opened her email. Nothing suspicious. Next, her messages. Most were mundane exchanges with colleagues and friends. But then I found it, a thread with Kyle, innocuously titled Follow Up. My heart raced as I clicked it open. The messages were coded, careful, as if they knew the risk. References to meetings and discussions that made no sense in the context of our shared work. A particular line caught my eye. Last night was incredible. I can still taste you. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. The betrayal was undeniable now, no room for doubt or excuses. Anger coursed through me, but beneath it was a deep, aching sorrow. Kyle, my best friend, my brother in all but blood. How could they do this? But I couldn't act yet. I needed more than words on a screen. I needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would destroy their lies. I called in sick to work and spent the rest of the day plotting. Emma said she was meeting Kyle at the usual place. I had no idea where that was, but I'd find out. That evening, when Emma came home, she was as affectionate as ever, asking me about my day, laughing at my jokes. It was sickening. I played along, forcing myself to smile and act normal, all the while dying inside. By the time she fell asleep, I had made up my mind. Tomorrow I'd follow her. Whatever the cost, I'd uncover the truth. The next morning, Emma's routine was seamless, almost mechanical. She dressed sharply in her tailored blazer, kissed me on the cheek, and left with her usual bright smile. Her mask of innocence was flawless, but I was no longer blind to the cracks beneath. As soon as she walked out the door, I grabbed my jacket and keys. I gave her a head start before slipping into my car and tailing her. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension. I wasn't sure what I would find, or if I could even handle the truth, but I couldn't stop myself. The need to know consumed me. Emma drove across town, weaving through morning traffic. My heart pounded as I followed her, careful to keep a safe distance. After about 20 minutes, she pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel. My stomach dropped. The usual place. She parked near the entrance and stepped out, her phone in hand. I parked across the street, my eyes glued to her every move. A few minutes later, a black SUV pulled up beside her. Kyle stepped out, grinning like the smug bastard he was. My jaw tightened as I watched him lean in, his hand brushing her waist. They exchanged a few words before disappearing inside the hotel together. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest, replaced by a black void of rage and despair. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to storm into that hotel, to drag them out and expose their treachery to the world. But another part of me, colder and more calculating, knew that wasn't enough. They had to pay for what they'd done, not just be caught but truly suffer. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos of them together outside the hotel. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I needed more, though, something undeniable. As I drove away, a dark plan began to take shape in my mind. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to destroy them. Slowly, methodically, piece by piece, I'd dismantle everything they held dear, just as they had done to me. This wasn't going to be revenge. This was going to be justice. My justice. I spent the rest of the day replaying what I'd seen, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Emma and Kyle thought they were clever, sneaking around behind my back. But now I had the upper hand. Their perfect little secret was in my hands, and I would use it to rip their lives apart. I began to plan. Step 1. Gather undeniable proof. A few photos of them outside a hotel wouldn't be enough. I needed something explicit, something they couldn't talk their way out of. I hired a private investigator, a man known for his discretion and effectiveness. I gave him the details, names, locations, and times, and told him to dig up everything he could. Step 2. Control the narrative. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. Kyle and I co-owned an architecture firm, a company we had built from the ground up. If word of this affair leaked, his reputation and mine would be at stake. I couldn't afford that, but I could use it to ruin him. Slowly. That evening, when Emma came home, I played my part perfectly. I greeted her with a smile, cooked her favorite dinner, and listened as she told me about her day. She was a flawless actress, weaving lies with ease. Every laugh, every glance, every touch felt like a dagger to my heart. But I didn't let it show. If I tipped her off, she'd grow cautious, and I couldn't allow that. Over the next few days, the investigator sent me updates. He had followed them to the hotel again, capturing photos and audio of their meetings. The evidence was damning. Intimate moments in the lobby, whispered conversations in the elevator, and finally, video footage of them entering a room together. My stomach churned as I reviewed it, but I forced myself to watch. I needed to stay focused to remember why I was doing this. Step 3. Isolate them. I started planting seeds of doubt among our mutual friends and colleagues. Casual remarks about Kyle's recent behavior, subtle hints about Emma's late nights at work. Nothing overt, just enough to make people suspicious. But the real test came when I invited Kyle to lunch. Sitting across from him, I forced a smile, pretending everything was normal. "You've been a bit distant lately," I said casually. "Everything okay?" Kyle hesitated for a split second before laughing it off. "Just busy, you know how it is." I nodded, my anger simmering beneath the surface. I wanted to lunge across the table, to confront him right then and there. But I held back. The time wasn't right yet. As I walked away from that lunch, I realized I wasn't just angry, I was hungry. Hungry for revenge. And when I finally struck, it would be devastating. The time had come to begin dismantling their lives, piece by calculated piece. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a confrontation.
No screaming, no accusations.
I wanted them to unravel, to feel the weight of their actions crushing them from every angle. The first strike was aimed at Kyle. Our firm had just landed a lucrative project, a sprawling office complex for a high-profile client. Kyle had been eager to oversee it, desperate for the spotlight. But I had other plans. I scheduled an emergency meeting with the client and presented my case. Kyle's recent erratic behavior, his personal distractions affecting his performance. I planted enough doubt to have him quietly removed from the project, with me taking the lead instead. The blow to his ego was immediate. That evening he called me. Why the hell was I sidelined? His voice was tense, laced with anger. It wasn't my decision, I lied smoothly. The client expressed concerns about your availability. I had to act in the firm's best interest. He was furious, but he couldn't argue. I had positioned myself as the responsible partner, the one cleaning up his mess. This was only the beginning. Next, I targeted Emma. Her professional reputation was as important to her as mine was to me. She prided herself on her image, a sharp, ethical lawyer with a flawless record. But no one is invincible. I anonymously sent the damning photos of her and Kyle outside the hotel to her firm's HR department. Not the explicit ones, just enough to suggest impropriety. The corporate world thrives on whispers, and I knew those photos would ignite a wildfire of rumors. 2 days later, Emma came home visibly shaken. She didn't mention the incident, but I noticed the way her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of wine. Tough day at work? I asked, feigning concern. She nodded, her eyes distant. Just office politics, she muttered. I wanted to laugh at the irony. She had no idea I was the architect of her unraveling. Meanwhile, I continued to play the devoted husband. I cooked her favorite meals, brought her coffee in bed, and listened as she vented about her stressful days. It was almost enjoyable, watching her squirm under the weight of her guilt, knowing she was oblivious to what was coming next. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. I had something far more personal in store for both of them. Something that would destroy not just their reputations, but their very sense of security. The groundwork was laid. Now it was time to tighten the noose. The cracks in their perfect little world were starting to show, and I was determined to widen them until everything they had built together collapsed. Emma's distracted demeanor became a daily occurrence, and Kyle's frustrations at work were boiling over. They were both unraveling, but I wasn't done yet. It was time to push harder. I scheduled a surprise dinner party at our home, inviting a small group of close friends and colleagues, including Kyle. Emma was caught off guard when I announced it that morning. A dinner party? Tonight? She asked, her voice tinged with unease. Just a little gathering, I said with a smile. We haven't seen everyone in a while. I thought it would be nice. She hesitated but eventually agreed, not wanting to appear suspicious. What choice did she have? That evening, the house was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Emma played the perfect hostess, though I could see the tension in her forced smiles. Kyle, on the other hand, avoided my gaze, his discomfort palpable. Halfway through dinner, I decided it was time to strike. So, Kyle, I began, swirling my wine. How's everything going with that big client project? Oh, wait. You're not on it anymore, are you? The table fell silent. Kyle's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he shot me a sharp look. It's just a temporary reassignment, he muttered. Things like this happen. Of course, I said, feigning innocence. Though it must be hard to focus with so many distractions. Emma stiffened beside me, her grip tightening on her glass. She knew I was playing a dangerous game but couldn't say anything without revealing herself. Kyle's face reddened, his composure slipping. I let the silence linger just long enough to make them both uncomfortable before changing the subject, acting as though nothing had happened. The tension in the room was delicious, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. After the guests left, Emma turned to me, her face pale. "What was that about?" she asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "What was what?" I replied, pretending not to understand. She shook her head, frustration flashing in her eyes. "Never mind." I smiled to myself as she walked away. She was on edge, teetering on the brink, and that was exactly where I wanted her. The next day, I took things a step further. Using a burner phone, I sent an anonymous text to Kyle's wife, Sarah. "Your husband and Emma have been meeting at the Sunview Hotel. Check room 312 if you want proof." I knew Sarah well enough to predict her reaction. She was fiercely protective and wouldn't let something like this slide. By the time evening rolled around, the storm I had set in motion was already raging. I just had to sit back and wait for the fallout. By the next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, none of which I answered. I already knew the chaos I had unleashed was taking its toll. Sarah, Kyle's wife, was not one to sit idly by. That evening, Emma came home late, her face pale and drawn. She barely looked at me as she slipped off her heels and poured herself a stiff drink. "Tough day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just work stuff." I fought back a smirk. "Anything I can help with?" She shook her head, her hand trembling as she lifted the glass to her lips. I knew the walls were closing in on her, and soon she'd have no way out. The next day, I got confirmation that my plan was working. Sarah had confronted Kyle, furious and armed with the anonymous text and all the suspicions I had carefully planted. According to my investigator, the confrontation had been explosive. Kyle had tried to deny everything at first, but Sarah wasn't buying it. She threatened to leave him, to take their kids and half of everything he owned. Emma was dragged into the storm soon after. Kyle, desperate to salvage his marriage, had thrown her under the bus. He told Sarah it was all Emma's idea, that she had seduced him, and he had been powerless to resist. I almost laughed when I heard that. Pathetic. When Emma came home that night, she was livid. She slammed her briefcase onto the counter, her eyes blazing as she turned to me. "Have you heard from Kyle?" she demanded.
No, primer lit, feigning confusion.
"Why?" She hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through her hair. "He's causing problems. Sarah's been spreading rumors." "What kind of rumors?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Emma hesitated again, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But it did matter. She was panicking, and it showed. I could see the cracks widening, her composure slipping. Later that night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with the next steps. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and the fallout had begun. But this was just the prelude. The real destruction was yet to come. I wasn't just going to expose them, I was going to annihilate them, together and separately. By the time I was done, there would be nothing left of the life they had built on my betrayal. The fallout was beginning to consume Emma and Kyle, and I watched with grim satisfaction as their lives started to unravel. But I wasn't done. This was just the beginning of their descent. The next day, I casually texted Sarah again, using the burner phone. "If you think Kyle is telling the truth, ask Emma about the private lunches at Maison Rouge every Thursday. Check their receipts if you don't believe me." I knew Sarah wouldn't hesitate. She had become my unwitting accomplice, digging deeper into Kyle's lies, fueling their mutual destruction. By that evening, Sarah had confronted Emma directly. I could only imagine how that conversation went, but the aftermath was undeniable. Emma stormed into the house, slamming the door behind her. She looked like she had been through a war. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I put down the book I wasn't really reading and gave her my full attention, pretending to be concerned. "What's wrong?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, but me. Sarah accused me of having an affair with Kyle. Can you believe that? I leaned back in my chair, masking my rage with a calm expression. Why would she think that? Emma froze, caught off guard by my question. "I don't know," She's just paranoid. I tilted my head, studying her. Paranoid about what? Did something happen? She looked at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might confess, but then she shook her head.
No.
Of course not. Her denial was almost impressive. Almost. That's ridiculous, I said, feigning disbelief. You should talk to her. Clear this up. She nodded, biting her lip. I will. It's just complicated. I watched her retreat upstairs, her shoulders slumped. She was cracking under the pressure, and it wouldn't be long before the weight of her lies crushed her entirely. The next day, I took things further. I planted a file in Emma's email inbox, carefully crafted to look like a misdelivered internal memo from her law firm. The document detailed an anonymous complaint about her unprofessional behavior and referenced her inappropriate relationship with a client, Kyle. When Emma opened the file that evening, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She gasped, her face draining of color as she read the damning accusations. "What is this?" she whispered, turning to me in panic. I stepped closer, pretending to read over her shoulder. "It looks serious," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Have you talked to anyone at work about it?" "No," she said quickly, slamming her laptop shut. "It's probably a mistake." She tried to brush it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was terrified of losing her career, her reputation. And that fear was exactly what I wanted. Emma and Kyle were spiraling, their lives unraveling faster than I could have hoped. But I wasn't done yet. The final act was coming, and it would be brutal. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. Emma and Kyle were walking on thin ice, and I was the one holding the heat lamp. Their paranoia had set in, and now I just had to nudge them into destroying themselves. The beauty of it all was that neither of them knew the true source of their misery. They were blaming each other, their spouses, and the world, but never me. The following week, I orchestrated my next move: financial sabotage. Kyle and I had always kept meticulous records for our firm, but I had started to manipulate the books just enough to make it look like Kyle was siphoning funds for personal use. I left a trail, subtle but damning, that led directly back to him. Then I tipped off one of our board members anonymously, suggesting they take a closer look at recent transactions. The board meeting where the issue came to light was glorious. Kyle stammered, trying to defend himself, but the numbers didn't lie. I sat quietly, letting him hang himself with every desperate excuse. Afterward, Kyle confronted me in the parking lot. "You think I don't know what's going on?" he hissed, his face red with anger. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my tone calm and measured. "Maybe you should spend less time distracted and more time focusing on your responsibilities." His eyes widened as he caught the implication. I walked away, leaving him to stew in his own guilt and fury. Emma, meanwhile, was facing her own storm. The fake HR memo I'd planted had done its job, and now she was being watched more closely at work. I made sure to follow up by sending an anonymous email to one of her firm's senior partners, suggesting that she had questionable dealings with a client. When Emma came home that evening, she was visibly shaken. "They're auditing my cases," she said, pacing the living room. "I don't know why, but someone's feeding them lies about me." I feigned concern. "Do you think it's Sarah? Maybe she's trying to retaliate for accusing you of, you know." Emma stopped pacing, her face tightening. "It has to be. She's out to ruin me." I nodded sympathetically, though inside, I was savoring every moment. Emma was so consumed by the chaos around her that she couldn't see the strings I was pulling behind the scenes. That night, I sent Sarah one last message from the burner phone. "Kyle and Emma have been lying to everyone. If you want proof, check his phone. Look at the messages from last month." I knew Kyle was careless, and I was counting on Sarah to find the texts he hadn't bothered to delete. Sure enough, she did. The next day, Kyle moved out of their house, his marriage effectively over. He called me desperate and angry. "She's lost her mind, man," he said. "She's accusing me of all kinds of shit. Maybe you should come clean," I suggested, my voice cold. "Honesty might help." He paused, as if realizing there was no point in lying to me. I didn't mean for this to happen, Dan. I swear. It just happened. Hearing his pathetic confession made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. We'll talk later, I said and hung up. Now they were both isolated, vulnerable, and desperate. The web was tightening, and soon I would deliver the final blow. They thought they could betray me and get away with it. They were wrong. With Kyle's marriage in ruins and Emma teetering on the edge at work, the stage was set for my grand finale. They had betrayed me together, so it was only fitting that their downfall would be a shared experience. One they'd never forget. I waited until Friday evening. Emma told me she had a late meeting at work, and I didn't question her. I already knew exactly where she was going. Their usual hotel, room 312. The private investigator had tipped me off earlier in the day. But this time I wasn't going to sit idly by. I had arranged something special. I arrived at the hotel half an hour after Emma, carrying a duffel bag. I checked in under a fake name and made my way upstairs, stopping briefly outside their room. I could hear them laughing softly inside. My chest burned with rage, but I stayed calm. This wasn't the time for impulsive action. Instead, I set up my equipment in the room directly across the hall, cameras positioned perfectly to capture everything as it unfolded. Step 1 was already in motion. Before heading to the hotel, I had sent an email from the burner account to Emma's law firm and Kyle's most important client. The email included a video compilation of their earlier hotel escapades, edited carefully to show them entering and leaving together repeatedly. Alongside the video, I included an anonymous message. You should know who you're trusting with your business. This isn't the first time they've been here together. By the time I was at the hotel, the email had been delivered, and the damage was spreading. Their reputations were about to be obliterated. Step 2 came next. I sent another text to Sarah from the burner phone. He's at the Sunview Hotel right now, room 312. If you want to confront them, now's your chance. Then, I sent the same text to Emma's boss at her law firm and a trusted colleague of Kyle's at our firm. This wasn't just about exposing them, it was about maximum humiliation. I didn't have to wait long. Within 30 minutes, the chaos began. Sarah arrived first, barging into the lobby, her face flushed with fury. I watched from the camera feed as she demanded the room number from the front desk. Moments later, Emma's boss appeared, along with Kyle's colleague. By the time they reached room 312, I was outside in the hallway, watching from the shadows. Sarah pounded on the door, screaming Kyle's name. When he opened it, shirtless and confused, she shoved past him, yelling loud enough for the entire floor to hear. Emma appeared moments later, hastily wrapping herself in a hotel robe, her face pale as a ghost. What the hell is going on here? Emma's boss demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Kyle's colleague looked disgusted, shaking his head as he muttered, "Unbelievable." The shouting escalated, spilling into the hallway as hotel staff arrived to manage the scene. I stayed hidden, recording the entire fiasco on my phone for good measure. The sight of their humiliation, their lies exposed so publicly, was everything I had hoped for. As security escorted Sarah and the others out, I slipped away unnoticed, my heart pounding with satisfaction. The world now knew the truth about them. Their careers, their reputations, their relationships. It was all in ruins. When I got home that night, Emma wasn't there. She didn't return until the next morning, her face hollow, her eyes red from crying. "I can explain," she whispered, her voice trembling. I looked at her, my expression cold and unreadable. "Don't bother," I said. "You've already said enough." And with that, I walked out of the house, leaving her to the wreckage she had created. The morning after the explosion at the hotel, the world felt eerily calm. I sat at a cafe downtown, sipping coffee and reading the headlines on my phone. News of the scandal had spread like wildfire within our professional circles. Emma and Kyle's reputations were in tatters, and I had front-row seats to their downfall. Emma's law firm wasted no time. By noon, I received a message from a mutual friend confirming her suspension pending a full investigation. The firm didn't tolerate scandal, especially one that might tarnish their high-profile image. Kyle's situation wasn't much better. Our firm's board members had called an emergency meeting to discuss his conduct unbecoming of a partner. I had orchestrated every detail to ensure they would both lose the careers they cherished so much. Without their jobs, their lives would fall apart even faster. When I returned home that afternoon, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look up as I entered, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. "They suspended me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I placed my keys on the counter, keeping my tone neutral. "I heard." She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of desperation and guilt. "Dan, I need to explain. I made a mistake, but I never meant to hurt you." Her words were hollow, empty apologies from a woman who knew she had lost everything. I didn't reply, letting the silence between us stretch until it became unbearable. "Say something," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "What do you want me to say?" I finally asked, my voice cold. "That I forgive you? That we can move past this?" "Because we can't, Emma. You destroyed everything." Tears streamed down her face as she reached out for me, but I stepped back, her touch repulsive now. "You didn't just betray me," I continued, my voice rising. "You betrayed everything we built. Our marriage, our life. For what? For him." She sobbed, unable to respond. And I didn't care. I was done with her. Kyle predictably tried to contact me that evening. He left a voicemail, his voice trembling with desperation. "Dan, I know you're angry, but we need to talk. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please call me back." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. He didn't deserve my time or attention. He was no longer my friend, no longer my partner. He was nothing to me now. That night, I began packing a bag. Emma watched from the doorway, her eyes wide with panic. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "I don't want to be here anymore." "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Anywhere but here," I replied. "This place is poison now." Her sobs followed me as I walked out the door, but I didn't look back. The house, the marriage, the life I thought we had, it was all gone. And I had no intention of salvaging the wreckage. This wasn't the end for them, though. Not yet. I still had one last move to make. Leaving the house was freeing, but my revenge wasn't complete. Kyle and Emma needed to experience the full weight of their betrayal. Their humiliation, their ruined reputations, and their broken relationships were satisfying, but I wanted them to feel truly alone, with no path to redemption. I checked into a hotel on the other side of town, away from the chaos, and spent the evening refining my next move. This was going to be personal, raw, and irrevocable. The next morning, I met with Sarah at a quiet cafe. Her eyes were bloodshot, her demeanor fragile, but behind her exhaustion, I saw anger, a fire that mirrored my own. "I don't even know who he is anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "After everything we've been through, how could he do this?" "I understand," I said softly, "but we can't let them get away with it. They've hurt us, destroyed everything we cared about. They think they can just move on, but they're wrong." Sarah looked at me, her brow furrowing. "What are you suggesting?" I leaned in, my voice low but firm. "We expose them completely, publicly. No one will ever trust them again. Not professionally, not personally. We make them pariahs." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse. But then she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Together, we put the plan into action. Sarah had access to Kyle's personal finances and emails, and she dug up everything she could. Evidence of embezzlement, inappropriate expenses, and explicit messages between him and Emma. Meanwhile, I worked on Emma's end, compiling evidence of her misconduct at work and her personal transgressions. By the end of the week, we had everything we needed. Step 1 was targeting their professional networks. Sarah sent the evidence of Kyle's financial misconduct to every major client of our firm, framing him as an unethical, untrustworthy fraud. Simultaneously, I forwarded Emma's incriminating emails and hotel footage to her firm's partners and key clients. The fallout was immediate. Kyle was fired from the firm, escorted out of the building in disgrace. Emma's law firm announced her termination the following day, citing irreparable damage to the firm's reputation. Both of their careers were effectively over. Step 2 was personal. Sarah and I uploaded a carefully edited video to social media, combining clips of Kyle and Emma's affair with damning financial and professional evidence. The video went viral in our circles, shared among friends, colleagues, and even local news outlets. Their betrayal, their lies, their hypocrisy. Everything was laid bare for the world to see. Emma called me that night, her voice raw with desperation. "Dan, please," she begged. "You have to help me. People are harassing me online. My parents won't even talk to me. I don't know what to do." I stayed silent, letting her sob into the phone. When she finally stopped, I spoke, my voice cold and unyielding. "You did this to yourself, Emma. This is what you deserve." I hung up before she could respond. Kyle, too, tried to reach out, leaving me a string of voicemails filled with anger, desperation, and regret. I ignored every one of them. He was nothing to me now, just another casualty of his own greed and selfishness. By the end of the week, they were both ruined. Their careers, relationships, and reputations were beyond repair. They had nothing left but each other, and even that was crumbling under the weight of their shared guilt and shame. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel pity. I felt free. The dust was settling, and Emma and Kyle were left to face the wreckage. I, however, was free from their lies, from the pain they'd inflicted, and from the facade I had built my life upon. But their suffering wasn't over yet. I kept tabs on them from a distance, watching as they scrambled to piece together their shattered lives. Emma had moved into a small, run-down apartment after being forced to sell our house. She had no job, no friends, and no allies. Even her family had distanced themselves, ashamed of the scandal she'd brought upon them. Kyle wasn't faring much better. Sarah had filed for divorce, taking the house, the kids, and a significant portion of his savings. His name was poison in our industry, and no one would hire him. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was living in a cheap motel, drowning his sorrows in alcohol. Despite everything, they still clung to each other, bound by their shared misery. They had become pariahs, outcasts in a world that once adored them. One evening, I received an unexpected email from Emma. The subject line simply read, "I'm sorry." I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I wanted to read what she had to say. When I finally did, her words were desperate and raw. "Dan, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am. What I did was unforgivable, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to ever take me back, but I just wanted you to know that I hate myself for what I did to you." I stared at the email for a long time before deleting it. Her apologies meant nothing to me now. She had destroyed the life we built together, and no amount of regret could change that. Later that week, I heard from Sarah. She wanted to meet, to talk about everything. I agreed, curious about what she had to say. When we met at a small cafe, she looked different, stronger, more determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, "for showing me the truth. It hurt, but I needed to see it." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "What will you do now?" She shrugged. "Focus on the kids, on myself. Kyle's out of our lives for good. I'll make sure of that." We talked for a while, sharing stories of our pain and healing. It was strangely cathartic, a reminder that life could go on, even after such a devastating betrayal. That night, as I walked home, I felt a strange sense of peace. My revenge was complete, my enemies defeated. Emma and Kyle had taken everything from me, but in the end, I had taken even more from them. They had nothing now, no careers, no families, no respect. All they had was each other, a cruel reminder of their shared failure. It was the perfect punishment, and I didn't regret a single moment. For the first time in months, I felt free, truly free. With my revenge complete, I turned my focus inward. For months, My life had revolved around destruction, and though it was satisfying to see Emma and Kyle reduced to the ashes they had created, I knew I couldn't live in that darkness forever. It was time to rebuild. Myself, my life, my future. I moved into a new apartment, a bright and modern space that felt nothing like the home I had shared with Emma. It was a fresh start, free from memories of her betrayal. I filled the space with things that made me happy. Artwork, books, and plants, and slowly began to feel like myself again. Work became my refuge. With Kyle gone, I took full control of our firm, rebranding it under my name and rebuilding its reputation. Clients who had once been wary returned, impressed by my professionalism and resilience. The firm flourished, and for the first time in years, I felt proud of what I had accomplished. One evening, while attending a networking event, I met someone. Her name was Claire, a journalist with a sharp wit and a disarming smile. She was nothing like Emma, and perhaps that was why I was drawn to her. She was direct, honest, and unafraid to challenge me in ways that felt refreshing. Our conversations were easy, flowing naturally from topic to topic. She didn't pry into my past, and I didn't feel the need to explain it. With her, I felt seen, not for what I had been through, but for who I was now. We began dating slowly, cautiously. I was still healing, and Claire respected that. She didn't push, didn't demand more than I could give. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope, a glimmer of light after months of darkness. Meanwhile, Emma and Kyle's downward spiral continued. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Kyle had left town, unable to face the disgrace he had brought upon himself. Emma, too, had disappeared from the social and professional circles we once shared. She was a ghost, her name spoken only in whispers and pity. I no longer felt anger when I thought of them. Instead, I felt nothing. They had become irrelevant, shadows of a life I had left behind. My focus was on the future, on building something new, something better. One day, Claire asked me about the scars I carried. Not the physical ones, but the emotional ones that lingered beneath the surface. "You don't have to tell me," she said, her voice gentle. "But if you want to, I'm here." For the first time, I opened up about everything, the betrayal, the revenge, and the emptiness I had felt after it was over. She listened without judgment, her eyes full of empathy. "I don't think revenge is ever truly satisfying," I admitted. "It doesn't fix what's broken. It just fills the void for a while." Claire nodded, her hand resting on mine. "But you're not broken anymore. You survived, and that says a lot about who you are." Her words stayed with me long after that conversation. She was right. I had survived. I had rebuilt. And now I was ready to move forward. For the first time in years, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: peace. Months passed, and life moved on. My relationship with Claire blossomed into something I hadn't thought possible after Emma. Something genuine, built on trust and mutual respect. I no longer looked over my shoulder, no longer let the past control me. What Kyle and Emma had done was a scar, but it no longer defined me. One day, while walking through the park with Claire, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was an email from Emma. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Dan, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I felt I had to reach out. I've lost everything. My job, my reputation, my family. Kyle's gone, and I'm alone. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to you, to us, and I hate myself for it. I know I can't undo the pain I caused, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I hope you found happiness again. You deserve it. Emma *. For a moment, I just stared at the words. They didn't evoke anger or satisfaction, just indifference. Emma was a ghost from a life I had left behind, and I had no desire to revisit that chapter. I deleted the email without responding. That evening, Claire and I cooked dinner together, laughing as we fumbled through a complicated recipe. As we sat down to eat, she looked at me with that sharp, knowing gaze of hers. "You seem lighter," she said. "Like you're finally letting go of something." I smiled, realizing she was right. "I think I am." She didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. Some things didn't need to be said. What mattered was that I was no longer weighed down by anger or pain. I had found a way to move forward, to embrace a future that felt full of promise. The following week, I officially closed the chapter on my old life. I sold the house Emma and I had once shared, using the proceeds to invest in expanding my firm. It was a symbolic act, a way of shedding the last remnants of a life that no longer existed. As I signed the paperwork, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over, truly over. Claire and I took a trip to the mountains soon after, escaping the city for a weekend of hiking and quiet reflection. Standing at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast expanse of nature, I felt a profound sense of peace. The betrayal, the revenge, the pain, it was all behind me now. Life had given me a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. As Claire slipped her hand into mine, I turned to her and smiled. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The past was a story I had survived. The future was a story I was ready to write.